Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me okay? Hello? Good evening. Welcome. Thanks for saying that back. This is a good crowd. I like it already. Welcome. My name is Katie O'Donnell, and I'm an event staffer here at Politics and Prose bookstore and virtual events, along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. For the full list of everything that we offer, you can visit us at our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, a few boring housekeeping items. If you could please silence your cell phones so as to not disrupt the event. And then when we get to the portion of tonight's conversation for audience questions, we have placed a standing microphone right here. It's hidden behind the pillar for some of you. If you are able to come to the microphone to ask your question, that will be your question, as well as it gets captured in our audio and video recording of tonight's event. Following up here at this table, we'll begin at the pillar, so if you have a book, we have plenty of copies behind the register for you to do so. And we do ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help our staff out tonight. So now on to the introduction. I'm excited to welcome Katherine Turk to discuss her new book, The Women of that Transformed America. Katherine She is an associate professor of history and an adjunct associate professor of gender studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Katherine will be in conversation this evening with Mary Jean Collins and Charlotte Clymer. Hold for applause. Mary Jean Collins joined the National Organization for Women in 1967 and became a now leader, deputy director of Catholics for a Free Choice, vice president of People for the American Way, and a board member of Choice USA. After moving to Chicago in 1968, Collins was elected president of the Chicago chapter of NOW. In 1980, Collins was again reelected as president of the Chicago chapter of NOW and helped direct the campaign to ratify the ERA in the Illinois General Assembly. She returned to leadership in NOW as a National Action Vice President from 1982 to 1985. She is a member of the Board of Veteran Feminists of America and the YWCA and the YWCA of the National Capital Area. Also in conversation tonight is Charlotte Clymer, who is a writer, communications consultant, LGBTQ activist, and the author of Charlotte's Web Thoughts newsletter on Substack. So please join me tonight in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Katherine Turk, Mary Jean Collins, and Charlotte Clymer.
Well, hello, everyone. What a wonderful crowd. It's so nice to see all of you here. Before we begin, we'd like to thank Politics and Prose. I'd like to thank my wonderful conversation partner, Mary Jean Collins, thank our moderator, Charlotte Clymer, and of course, all of you for joining us here tonight. I'm so excited for our conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to read a short section from the opening of the book and then say a few words, for a few minutes, about how the project came about and what it aims to do. And from there, we'll jump into conversation and save plenty of time for back and forth and exchange with you, our audience. So this is the first couple of pages of the first chapter, which is titled, We Recognized the Honest Fire. At 10 o'clock in the evening on June 29th, 1966, about 20 women crowded into Betty Friedan's suite at the Washington Hilton Hotel. The room's elegance matched the mandate of the conference that brought them to the Capitol, the third annual gathering of state commissions on the status of women, as a place for ladies, not troublemakers. Returning to their hotel by chartered bus, after a boozy reception and buffet in the State Department's beautiful Thomas Jefferson room, the women passed through the lobby, which was decked out with plush furniture, pink globe lights, and Art Nouveau stained glass windows, and into one of 6 elevators. Once in Friedan's suite, they filled paper cups with liquor from Friedan's little bar. Some lit cigarettes and kicked off their shoes, some folding their legs beneath their smart skirt suits or stretching them out. It was a relief to unwind after a long, long day packed with meetings. Pauli Murray surveyed the swelling gathering that she had helped to plan. Murray was a seasoned 55-year-old organizer and attorney with deep roots in the civil rights and workers' movements. The descendant of enslaved women and men, Murray was raised in segregated North Carolina. She understood how inequities of race, class, and gender interlocked in people's lives. In her view, the flourishing civil rights movement needed women's energies but gave priority to Black men's concerns. The labor movement privileged white women when it regarded their sex at all. Women's activism was segmented by race. Several decades earlier, white suffragists had marginalized Black women, then accepted narrowly framed voting rights that left Jim Crow limits intact. Murray was on a mission to link the struggles for gender equality and racial justice by centering Black women in both. She and her co-author had recently coined the term Jane Crow in an article for the George Washington Law Review, where they wrote about an analogy between racism and sexism in the law. But Murray was not content to keep her ideas on the pages of an academic journal. She waited somewhat impatiently for everyone to settle in that night because she felt the moment's urgency. After several minutes, Murray and Friedan told the group of their meeting's purpose, starting, quote, an independent national civil rights organization for women, as Murray later described it, that would have enough political power to compel government agencies to take seriously the problems of discrimination because of sex. Murray and most of the others had spent the past year debating how to end government officials' foot dragging, and they were ready for action. Those East Coast lawyers and government workers in the room had seen women's rights become a common joke among powerful men in Washington. Fearful that outspoken activism could jeopardize their own careers, they believed that Friedan, by then a minor celebrity for publishing the Feminine Mystique 3 years earlier, had the independence and notoriety to become the public face of a strong new organization. Such a group was needed, they explained, because the landscape of women's activism, while robust, was diffuse. There were women's groups dedicated to myriad causes. Women were also active in political parties, labor unions, and civil rights, anti-war, and consumer groups. A new pressure group could unite them and focus their power. Murray and her collaborators were surprised when they were met with ambivalence. The Wisconsin labor leader, Catherine Conroy, was among those who listened with skepticism. At 47, she was nearly a decade younger than Murray, but she too had spent many years inside male-led movements. Conroy was, quote, built square, said a friend, wore no makeup, and dressed like a dowdy elementary school teacher, with no pearls for sure. The daughter of a Milwaukee antiques dealer who was ruined in the Great Depression, Conroy found a job after high school as a telephone operator. It was hard work for low pay, and she saw how the bosses exploited women through stereotypes about their docility. She took a post in her union, the Communications Workers of America, where her so-called brothers put their own needs first, always. But Conroy and the other members of Wisconsin's Commission on the Status of Women were working well with state lawmakers. Why should women jeopardize good relationships with government officials? And wouldn't another association simply stretch their efforts thinner? Murray tried to keep order, explaining the plan she had outlined on her yellow legal pad, but the tensions escalated. The Wisconsinites became frustrated that the gathering they had believed was purely social seemed to have an unspoken agenda. Those from the East Coast in the room were treating their questions as though they were not worth considering at all. As the Wisconsinites surmised, the meeting's planners, including Murray and Friedan, had already decided, after months of strategizing, that a new organization was desperately needed. After a few more minutes of debate, the room erupted into chaos. Eventually, Friedan, overcome with resentment, locked herself in her own hotel room's bathroom. The meeting was over, she claimed. their proposed civil rights group for women seemed to collapse before they had finished drawing its blueprint. But of course, it did not collapse, and the National Organization for Women has had decades and decades at the leadership of one of the most important human rights movements of our time. So let me just take a few minutes to talk a little bit about how this project came to be, and then we'll enter into conversation. So like so many histories, this one began with a question in my own life, one that I started to ponder many years ago. Growing up, I was close with my maternal grandmother, an ambitious person with a knack for business, but who spent her prime as a housewife and mother in the 1950s and 60s. Her daughter, my mother, went to law school and carved out an impressive career as an attorney in Chicago, all while raising 3 daughters. And for me and my sisters, the sky was the limit in terms of what we could achieve, where we could go to school, what we could study, and what we could aspire to do and be in our own lives. And so this question stuck with me as I was growing up in the Chicago suburbs, as I studied history at Northwestern University and then graduate school at the University of Chicago. What could explain the changes in my own family and for so many families across the nation in that short span of years? Who made those changes and how did they accomplish it? As I intensified my study of women's history, I was simply not satisfied with the answers offered either in the scholarship I was reading or in the popular memory and sort of media accounts of quote-unquote second wave feminism. That movement is often framed in terms of its infighting, in terms of women's inability to get along with each other. As the narrative often goes, second wavers were sometimes elitist, sometimes narrow-minded, and often unable to work across their differences of ideology and identity. How then did they ever get anything done? Central to this puzzle, I think, has been a lack of knowledge about the National Organization for Women, which was the largest and most expansive organization of the quote-unquote second wave years. Scholars have generally downplayed now, to the extent they engage it at all, or positioned it as a kind of static backdrop to more allegedly radical forms of feminism that began to emerge a few years later. But now was at the very center of the feminism that erupted in the 1960s, and it remained at the center of the movement, and its history has a lot to offer us today. Now was founded in 1966 by many women, including seasoned civil rights and labor movement activists whose intention was to organize and advocate for all women by channeling their efforts into one association. Its members took that radical approach into street protests, meeting rooms, courtrooms, their own homes, their schools, their workplaces, community gatherings, and pretty much every place they went. Now demanded full abortion rights and constitutional equality for women in 1967, before other liberal and progressive organizations followed suit. Now pressured corporations to stop ripping women off as workers and as shoppers. Now pursued protections for women of color and lesbians, and now organized the Women's Strike for Equality on August 26, 1970, which was then the largest ever women's rights protest, which then sparked a mass movement. Yeah, thank you, Heather Booth. Happy to see you. From then on, now was a driving force behind each of the feminism of the 1970s accomplishments. That movement made gender equality a mainstream concept, and now's flexible chapters at the local level and national presence, strength at the national level, made that concept of gender equality actionable, something you could do something about. So to explain how now worked on the personal, local, national, and even international levels, this book follows the lives and activist careers of 3 very different, lesser-known members who did the hard work of organizing other women through now. And those women that the book profiles include Aileen Hernandez, a federal official of Jamaican heritage, Patricia Hill Burnett, a former beauty queen, artist, and Republican, and Mary Jean Collins, sitting here at the center. A union organizer, working class Catholic, and as you heard in her introduction, much, much more. So this trio represents the range of backgrounds and expansive feminist visions that members brought to NOW in the group's first 2 decades, when its open-ended blueprint inspired members to advance many different visions of a universal feminism. These women's experiences in every corner of their lives brought them to activism, and that activism shifted their perspective and changed their lives. Over the years, as NOW racked up wins, its members clashed over their competing notions of equality and debated their preferred strategies. The organization also galvanized an anti-feminist movement that defined itself as NOW's opposite, a backlash that ended up resetting NOW's agenda and continues to shape American politics and culture. Today, the issues that NOW tackled in the 1970s, from the Equal Rights Amendment to civil and reproductive rights, protections for workers and LGBTQ people, and economic inequality, are back in the headlines. And many Americans are angry that rights won by determined feminist organizing during NOW's heyday are being menaced and revoked. And this, I would argue, is why we need to understand the history of where those rights came from and earlier campaigns to try to achieve them. We need that history more than ever. Certainly, NOW's achievements offer us lessons in how to challenge institutions, shift cultural norms, and foster solidarities. Some of the missteps that we can read into NOW's history can also teach us about hard trade-offs, the damage of internal conflicts, and the perils of sacrificing grassroots agency for centralized control. So the book argues that while movements need individuals, like Mary Jean, and their ideas, organizations are just as essential. And even the largest such organizations can adapt to meet the challenges of their time. Of course, NOW's enduring structures are still here, still framing conversations about how to transform America into a more equal nation. And now it's time to dive into our conversation about this history as I wrote it, and as Mary Jean and many of you lived it, and as I hope we will all engage it together this evening. So thank you.
My goodness, I am just so deeply honored to be in conversation with these 2 brilliant leaders this evening. And so thank you so much, Katie, for inviting me. It's such an honor. My grandmother was my gateway to feminist education. And she is going to be so absolutely delighted to see video of me sitting next to Mary Jean Collins and having a conversation about the history of NOW.
She's a big deal.
Yes. I hope you all don't mind. I'm going to be insufferably millennial and refer to my notes on my phone. I'm also going to periodically check the time because we want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and these panels tend to go very, very quickly. Okay, so let's get started. I'm so excited. How did you select these 3 brilliant women out of the embarrassment of riches of women leaders in the history of NOW? Aileen Hernandez, Patricia Hill Burnett,
Yes.
and our own Mary Jean Collins.
Yes. So I've known Mary Jean since college. I wrote my senior thesis about NOW in Chicago, and through women including Mary Ann Lupa and Ann Ladke, women who are still in Chicago, still in the movement, they connected me to Mary Jean and her story, leading NOW's campaign against Sears Roebuck and Company, which was then the major retailer, ripping women off, one among many. So I knew the Midwestern story, and but also had a sense that the histories of feminism tended to privilege the coasts. And what we knew about NOW tended to be told through an Eastern lens, with a little bit of West Coast flavor sprinkled in. So I knew I wanted to have Mary Jean central in the story. But just as important to me was highlighting the kinds of diversity that women brought to the organization. The wildly ambitious idea, or not even idea, conviction that women across all of their differences not only could link arms and work together, but actually needed to. And so set out to find women who were, all three of whom were mentored by one of the founders of NOW. So one of the book's arguments is that as important as the founders of the organization are, and the book certainly gives them their due, the next generation, Mary Jean's generation, really tested whether NOW could work. So set out to find other leaders in the organization who could demonstrate, showcase the range of priorities and perspectives that women brought to now in these years. So Aileen Hernandez was now second president and put a real privilege on racial justice, bringing the concerns of women of color not only into now, but at the center of now's agenda. That was one of her major goals for the organization. And the more that I thought about who a third character could be, I looked for a Republican and thought that spotlighting the political diversity that women brought to this organization, which for the first 15 years of its life was adamantly nonpartisan. That could show, and then tracing the shifts in all of these women's lives and activism could show the great potential, but also the big turning points in now for its first 2 decades.
Well, thank you so much for selecting these 3 women. I mean, just reading about their trajectories, and of course, Mary Jean has just been, it was such a great read. And by the way, y'all, if you haven't bought this book, please buy it tonight. It will galvanize you, it will inspire you, it will empower you for the fight ahead. You start your introduction at the 1974 Now Convention in Houston. This is either the year after or the year that women were able to obtain a credit rating for the first time.
Yes,
I
74.
believe.
Yes,
Right, 74.
Equal Credit Act.
This is in the thick of the fight for the ERA.
Yes.
Why was Now so essential to the fight for feminism in the 60s and 70s?
So Now had so much going for it. In terms of its structure, its open-ended mission, Mary Jean can speak, and I hope will speak more to Now in those early 70s years when the grassroots was really leading the way. So any 10 women in your town, wherever it was, in the United States or overseas, could put in $5 a piece or claim a hardship and join for free and form a chapter that could then work on any issue you decided counted as a feminist issue. And as the chapters multiplied and more women came to Now, they shoved every issue they could think of under the umbrella of feminism and built such a robust organization that in the early 70s had up to 36 national task forces working on issues from women in athletics to, of course, abortion and reproductive rights to marriage and divorce to advertising, the arts, religion, anything anybody could think of. Now was, you had a great quote in the book, right, where you say if somebody wanted to do it, Now was going to try to do it,
Right.
whatever it was.
Right.
So Now had this incredible grassroots engine, but was also coordinated at the national level. So Now worked on many different fronts at once and pushed through many different avenues at once. And I think that's one reason why Now was able to accomplish as much as it did, the variety of its tactics and its open-ended appeal to all different kinds of members. But Mary Jean, I hope you'll speak from your perspective.
I think that's a very good summary. I just want to share with you how it felt to be one of those people. And I've said this to Katie and I've said it to other people. In what world would I have been in the same room with Patricia Burnett and Hernandez if it weren't for Now? In other words, there was a sentiment, I think, in women across the country as other movements were changing the country in dramatic ways through the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. There was this need and desire to actually begin the liberation of women. And so you got calls from people from towns you never heard of. I mean, it was amazing how much interest and desire there was to be a part of something for women. So I feel that it was a very lucky time. And the thing that Now did provide, it had this national leadership that was amazing. And I want to say this about people like Catherine Conroy and Friedan and other women like that. They started Now. They had nothing to gain personally. I mean, I've thought of this so many times. They weren't going to get some big new job. They already had that big new job. I mean, they were the people they were the women who had actually succeeded. The fact that they turned around to say to me, a 28-year-old from Milwaukee, a kid who didn't know much, that they involved me, that they cared whether I succeeded, and all these other women, all of us succeeded, was an amazing experience. It was like being found, and developed and loved in a different way than I had ever experienced. I just think the organization provided a place where women could actually learn and be and work ahead to change the world. And we thought there was no problem with doing that. Once we had the idea of changing the world, it was like, okay, we just have to do it. And so if somebody had some other crazy idea they wanted to do, well, that was fine with us too. We'll do another task force. That's how we got to 36, because people had a lot of ideas about what to do. But anyway, it was a very energized time. But now I don't think the things that happened and the women's movement that developed would have happened if Now hadn't been born. So I'm very grateful.
Mary Jane, what would most surprise people about these early years of Now?
I think people would be surprised by the founders, by these elitist women. When people say elitist women, founded Now, there's some truth to that. But then why did they spend their time, their every waking moment that wasn't at their job, creating this institution that would actually bring other women along? So that's what I think. I don't think that people know that. I don't think we experience that, and the book really, really helps us to know that. So I think that's one thing and then the energy that grew out of the call to action was just, something unparalleled.
Absolutely.
Right.
Katie, what do you think would be most
Question.
surprising to folks?
I think folks will be surprised if they read the book to see how much women were able to work across their differences. I think sometimes histories of feminism in these years kind of read women's differences back onto the movement and assume that differences of identity and ideology were kind of, in almost a deterministic way, were sort of fated to separate women and to make it so that they could not ultimately work together. And sometimes the disagreements that did erupt, right? How could they not? This is a massive organization dedicated to organizing a diverse cohort of people to do a really hard thing. Those disagreements are often characterized as catfights, which rooted in personalities or sort of a lack of energy or vision or something. But nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, there were fights and disagreements, but motivated by concerns about strategy. And certainly Now members were united in their dedication to advancing this gender revolution on women's behalf. They just fought really passionately and had different ideas about how to do that. But the book really shows how women of color, lesbians, older women, younger women, Democrats, Republicans, independents were able to productively work together through Now to get big things done. And in fact, women organizing across their differences might be the only way we can get these kinds of big things done. So that's one lesson that I hope folks will take from the book and from this story.
My grandmother has this phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. And it feels like there's always this tendency to frame social justice rights movements as two extremes. Either it is one of purity, or it's one of shattering and fracturing, which has always been true for every movement in this country, hands down, across the board. What would be the lessons that today's activists should draw on when we look back on all of these folks, and particularly the brilliant women leaders of the 60s and 70s who were fighting for gender equality, queer rights, racial equality, et cetera?
Do you want to take this one first, Mary G?
Well, I think what I would say is what they can learn from this book and what we can learn from each other is that we can do it. And that you just have to believe in yourself and believe in other women and other people. We can change. We don't have to put up with this shit, and we do too much of it. We do too much of it. We think we can't, and if you think you can't, really you can't. So that's what I think. Rereading even the now history and kind of reliving that part of my life, it was the optimism and the certainty that we were right, that women, I used to think people just hadn't thought of women's equality. Of course everybody's for it, but nobody had mentioned it to them. So now we were going to have to mention it to them, and of course they would listen to us. And I learned that wasn't exactly right, but I had that level of certainty that what we were about was the right thing for us and for our families and for our community and for the country.
And you persuaded people. I think you used a lot of different tactics to a kind of insider-outsider strategy, right? Where it now had folks working in government, working in big corporations, working in law, but also protesting in the streets, right? And filing claims with government agencies, and there was also a lot of humor involved, right? You very successfully mocked some of the sexists in advertising and in other corners of American life. So, but I would also underscore your point that you did it. You did so much. And that started with the common belief that women and their male allies would have to work together, but that change was possible, and that if you pursued your goals through enough different avenues at the same time, that you would win it. Right. And you did.
And I think one thing that I thought of before and forgot to mention is that was unique at that time. There were so many of these women that were around the founding of NOW, even though they couldn't officially be founders, were women who were in government, who were at the Women's Bureau, the Department of Labor, or the Department of Justice, who we had insiders. We really had insiders in a way that doesn't always happen now, where we were working, where we could, there was a collaboration. I mean, some of the people who thought they were being collaborated against were right. There was all these people inside the government who were forming things like the EEOC, which was a new institution after Title VII, and it had a hard time getting started. But there were insiders who understood what needed to be done, who told the outsiders what they should ask for. I mean, there was a real collaboration between the movement and the people inside the government, because it was basically Democrats, ran the country. How did we get Title VII, Title IX, the Equal Credit Act, all of this legislation in 10-year period? It was amazing how much it changed the country, and it was all done because we had progressives in the government.
But some sensible Republicans too.
So, but we had the sensible. Well, of course, Patricia, please, yes, yes, we did have sensible. Yeah, Milliken was the governor of Michigan, and yeah.
I do want to emphasize that it was a Nixon-controlled court that put Roe v. Wade into law.
Yes.
There were plenty of Republicans, including, a number of Republican politicians supported women's rights back then, which is almost unthinkable now.
Yes.
What was the secret to NOW's success? How did y'all go from a few dozen members in a hotel suite in 1966 to tens of thousands of active members, to say nothing of the broader movement in just a matter of years? I'm looking for tips.
I'll add one piece we haven't talked about as much before. Among the civil rights movement women and the labor movement women among NOW's founders built a structure that was intended to outlast any one generation of members. So the dues, the bylaws, the conferences, they're now certainly had members over the years who were not so into all the infrastructure and perhaps tried to tinker with it or even break some of it away. But the infrastructure and the structures have meant that NOW has endured through relatively good times for feminism. It's endured through the darker times for feminism, and of course it's still here. So I think one piece to the secret of NOW's success are the structures that the women from other movements that had strong organizations put into place and locked in 1966, 67.
I think that's right. It was attractive enough as an idea for people to want to be a part of it, and people wanted a different life. They didn't want their mother's life. They didn't want to be a housewife. They didn't want to be restricted in what they could do in work or who they could be. They really wanted a vehicle to get out of that, and so making that organization available that could help change the world in ways that they wanted to was extremely important.
Could I add one more thing,
Oh,
Charlotte?
please.
So we haven't talked as much about NOW and women of color and the important, the pivotal role that women of color, especially African-American women and Latina women, played at NOW's founding and continue to play through NOW's history. even through years when Now's leadership, which was often mostly white, didn't always understand that they needed to put the concerns of all different women, women who didn't have the most power outside of Now, that white women, middle-class women, couldn't have all the power inside of Now either. So these were fights about what Now's agenda was going to be, whose concerns it was going to prioritize. But the open-endedness of Now's mission, the assertion that it was going to stand for all women, provided an entering wedge for women whose concerns were not being taken as seriously by Now's leadership to confront those leaders and say, I'm a woman too, my concerns matter, and don't add my specific concerns at the end of a laundry list of things you're going to do. Put them right in the middle. And Now's ability to accommodate that has ebbed and flowed over time at the national and in the chapters, but Now is still grappling with those questions and working productively, as far as I can tell, on them. So I think I would just reemphasize the open-endedness of the mission, I think, is one piece of Now's longevity and effectiveness.
Oh, so well said. We have so many fans of Mary Jean and Katie here, and I know that we want to safeguard some time for Q&A, so start thinking of the questions you'd like to ask. I'm going to ask one more question, because I would be remiss not to bring this up. Is Kate Kelly here by chance? Kate Kelly? Oh, there she is. Oh, my God. So I wanted to ask about, I'm going to make a bold prediction. In my lifetime, I believe the Equal Rights Amendment will be ratified in the Constitution.
Better be.
I believe it will be. And I know there's a lot of skepticism over that, but I think there was also a lot of skepticism over whether or not there would be sufficient backlash over the Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court. And yet we just saw Kansas and Ohio overwhelmingly, 2 red states, overwhelmingly defeat the anti-choice position and fight for abortion rights. I would like to ask you both, what are your views on how we go about getting the ERA ratified, finally, fully having constitutional rights enshrined for all genders to have full equality?
Well, there's an ERA activist here I know well from Twitter. Nice to meet you, Kate. I think we can draw from Now's history the importance of pushing on many fronts at once. So making the political case, fighting in the court of public opinion, fighting in actual courts, convincing anybody who's convincible, and pushing out of the way, to the extent that we can, folks who are trying to stand in the way. And Now's history certainly shows the importance of a persistent drumbeat of pressure coming from many different fronts at once. So I certainly hope the ERA will be ratified too. And I know that the activists working on it are taking a lot of different approaches and have a lot of energy and creativity.
Well, I think there's no substitute, and there's no other way it's going to be ratified except to change the politics of this country. I mean, that's where, and that's true of other issues as well, restoring the rights lost under the Dobbs decision. We have to increase the number of voters who are going to vote for a progressive agenda, including these 2 very important issues, or we are not going to. We're not going to change. We just have to. So we have to devote more of our time to that, I think, and to utilize the anger about Dobbs and the anger about not being equal under the Constitution, and to tell people, we need to work with people. This is what I think Now did, particularly in the beginning, to really instruct people, to let people know how they can empower themselves and how they can empower their community, and that. And that's going to everybody. That's not just going to the liberal down the street. It's trying to go out to Nebraska. Yeah. I mean, we have to widen, I think, the people we're talking to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, Mary Jane. And before I get to the Q&A really quickly, I just want to point out something. I wish more people would keep saying this. We are all affected by Dobbs. Every single one of us. Doesn't matter who you are. Everyone's civil rights are affected by Dobbs. If the government can control anyone's body, they can control everyone's body. And if we're not saying that again and again, especially in this election cycle, we're not doing the job we need to be doing. Right. All right. I'll get off my soapbox. Let's start Q&A. I am so excited for these questions.
So I'm about 10 years younger than you. So I lived through this and benefited from it. I went to law school. There were... excuse me. I remember in the 1950s, when I was growing up, how a woman how she lived, depended on who she married.
Right.
And that's no longer true. But my question is, you've changed the issues. I mean, the issues now are different. It's not so much that women can work and can get better jobs. It's that they have to work. If there's not enough money, they can't get what used to be called welfare unless they work. And it takes 2 salaries or 2 incomes to support a family. And that's a problem too, because of children. I mean, my mother didn't want to work. My grandmothers both worked, and my mother was very happy not to work. She was the first in her first generation to go to college, and she was perfectly happy to be with her friends who all had children. It was the beginning of the baby boom in the late 40s. So you have to figure out what you're going to do with this. Is not a stable situation. We have children who are not taken care of. Child care is kind of happenstance and whatever, but women have to work now, whether they want to or not, whether they like their jobs or not, whether it's a career or a job. And I wondered, in the next generation of now, how you're thinking about these issues.
Well, I would say, I mean, now was always concerned with childcare, with high
Right.
quality access to childcare,
Right.
but also rights for homemakers. And so I think if you boil all of Now's iterations back to its founding, down to their core, it's about women being able to define and control their own lives. So not only having a seat at the table at the boardroom, or the right to work the same crummy job that your brother does, but to have enough economic means to support yourself and have a good life. So I see what you're saying about this being a different context, at least probably for white women, right? For women of color, they always had to work.
They always had to work.
But I think you can reread Now's statement of purpose, some of its founding documents, and most of it holds up, and most of it we still don't have.
But the economy depends now on women working, so they don't have a choice about whether to stay home with children. Someone has to take care of the children, but they have to work. They don't have. They didn't have freedom then to work, and now they don't have freedom not to work. The economy is set up.
Still a lot of work to do.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that these movements have been very successful and needed and came at the right time. And do you think that they have actually become very successful so that there's a blurring of lines between what religions people are, genders, and to some extent race, and take something like the LGBT community relationship with the women's movement, and you have like men who are women and women who are men, and is it getting kind of confusing as far as what goals are still unmet?
Katie, can I say something here? The modern feminist movement has been overwhelmingly supportive of trans rights. I think there is a great, destructive, horrible myth that feminists do not support trans people, and that is just completely false-headed. That is a propaganda piece that has been pushed by the right wing consistently. It holds no water whatsoever. When you look at every major feminist organization today, they fully stand beside trans rights. Now, I'm a white person. I'm not going to speak to the space of racial equality. That's not my place. But I will say, when it comes to LGBTQ rights specifically, LGBTQ rights and feminist rights are in lockstep these days. And I think that comes from the hard work of just not only queer activists, but labor activists, especially activists of color. And so I just want to be clear about that. I don't want anyone to leave this room believing that there is some schism between LGBTQ people and feminists, because that is just not the case at all. Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
No, I think let's leave it there. Thank you.
And my second question...
No, actually, there's such a long line. Let's
okay.
move through. Thank you.
I have a quick comment and a question. Mary Jean, thank you very much for mentioning those government insiders who were part of the founding of NOW. And in the great spirit of say her name, my friend Catherine East was one of those great
Also
founders.
from Wisconsin.
That's right. And just wanted everybody to know who she was. She ended up working for feminism her entire life. She ended up working for the ERA, National Women's Political Caucus, and she was terrific. And thank you for mentioning her in your book. My question is this. I've read a couple of book reviews, and I haven't read the books. I've just read the reviews saying, oh, those 70s feminists, oh, those now people, they didn't really do anything, and they were just, they're a bunch of white elitists, and they were just after their own privilege and blah, 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 blah. And how do we we all know what we did in the 70s and 80s, and how do we sort of protect that history and also get young women more committed to and involved in the ERA and an understanding of why we need it? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I love your ERA button.
It's an original.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's vintage, priceless. I think that what you said about the myths about the movement, or the sort of mainstream narratives about the movement as being white, middle class, out of touch, self-interested, it's just not true if you look in the archive and you look at the evidence. So, I answer that question as a historian, so we need to look at the evidence. Now's archive is huge. It's way too much for any one scholar to look at in their lifetime or several lifetimes, but you can dip into Now's archive and very quickly understand that while there were fights about positions and which types of women to give priority to at different times, most of the women who got the stuff done, who got the work done in Now, were women like Mary Jean. So the book tries to really push back against this myth and shows that women of all different backgrounds sought to work together, and they did work together productively on behalf of a broad swath of women. So as a historian, we just need to keep digging into the evidence, lifting up the stories, and there are many, many, many more books to be written in Now's archive, and so I hope there are budding scholars out there. It's a rich, rich field.
And I have to say thank you again, Katie, for your book and telling the truth, and also for bringing Aileen Hernandez back into public discussion where she hasn't been. And she was a lovely human being and did so much for women and was a black feminist to her core. And thank you.
Okay.
Hi, so excited for your book. And I was like, what? This is so exciting. So thrilled to be here. I'm a member of the DC chapter of Now, which still exists, and everyone in this room should be a member of. DC-now.org. Rose is the president of DC Now. Stand up, Rose. Come on.
Stand up, Rose. Stand up, Rose, yay.
So Rose is the current president of DC Now, and I say that to say that Now definitely does exist. I went to the National Now conference 2 months ago, and there were probably, I would say, 200 people. There were 4 people under the age of 25, and all of them were paid interns. So there were 0 people under the age of 25 who were not paid to be there. And I was also like one of the youngest people, and I'm 42, so I'm not that young. So my question is, my fascination with Now is a constant quest to reclaim this heyday where there was a formal organization that had political power and could make demands of the federal government and get meetings and be invited to the White House and accomplish a really robust list of objectives. So my question is, not that you can answer this, but I'm just interested in your feelings. Is there a possibility to revive Now as an organization? Does it need to be another organization? This is why I'm obsessed. I'm so very excited to read your book and obsessed with Now, because I think we have to have an organization. When everyone considers them a feminist and it's a brand, and you can go to the Barbie movie and you're like, I'm a feminist. It's it means if it means everything, it means nothing. And if we can't join an organization and have a card and have a group and start a chapter, we don't have a structure. So how do we get that structure? Does it have to be something new? Does it have to be more gender inclusive? Like, will people even identify with something that has women in the title? Like, I'm just not sure that that's the case, judging on how many people, young people under the age of 25 went to the NOW conference and are involved. Even in local chapters, there's very, very few people, I would say even under the age of 60, in most NOW chapters. So how do we resurrect? Do we reinvent? What do we do?
Well, let me bring a historian's eye to that big question. I mean, I think NOW was at its most effective when it was really solid at the grassroots and grassroots driven. So I applaud your DC NOW chapter. Bring me to a meeting. I'll Zoom or come back. I'd love to meet all of you. But it just, and NOW also at the various points has had robust college campus organizing. So organizing in communities, organizing on college campuses. As someone who teaches hundreds of 18 to 22-year-olds every year, and just on Monday I'll teach my big Women in American History survey. I mean, young people are desperate for this history, and especially in this age of Dobbs and other assaults on gender and individual rights, they want to understand where those rights came from, and they want to understand how to get them back. So, I mean, it's hard work. What Mary Jean and her colleagues did is the hard work of organizing across differences and working at the grassroots. But, I mean, having looked carefully at the whole swath of NOW's history, it was the most effective when it was the most solid at the grassroots. And the national leaders could speak with the voice of hundreds of thousands of women who had not only paid a check for their national dues, but showed up to meetings and showed up to protests. And maybe it is time the time is right for a heyday of that kind of organizing, that kind of mass movement that's about people out in the streets, people filing claims, people confronting jerks. But that's, history shows us it can be done. Do you want to say anything, Mary Jean?
It can be done, and go do it. And I went to the DC NOW chapter, and actually nobody, I don't think, was over 40 or 50 at least. It was a younger group and a very social group, and I thought it was a model. I think the thing that we worked really hard, but we also had a drink after, and some of my friends. A friend, Rosemary Trowbridge, is here. We met 40 years ago and now, or 50 years ago and now. She wouldn't be in my life if it weren't for NOW. The rewards are enormous. Get out there. Have some fun.
Amen.
Oh, here we go.
By the way, the last question, I've loved all the questions. I love this whole evening. But just imagine how far we've come when you said feminism means everything. Maybe it means nothing. But seeing the Barbie movie recently and thinking Mattel is talking about patriarchy. Like, we have come a long way and have a long way to go. But it's certainly a different world that you helped to make. I have so loved this presentation so much that it's like I want to read it while you're talking. I don't know how to, I can't keep my head with it. By the way, I thought
you're in there, Heather.
I thought the questions were fabulous. I'm so grateful you wrote it. In part, I've come up just to thank Mary Jean. Many of us in this crowd are your fans. Mary Jean is a historic figure. It is true you chose lesser-known figures, but Mary Jean played a historic role that not only changed many of our lives personally and millions of others, but I do believe that the influence she had within NOW, and even had she had more influence, I think it might even have changed the direction of a women's movement to ensure that there could be a direction that combined race and gender and class and organizing at every level. So I really have come up to thank you all. Thank you
Love
for the
you,
book.
Heather.
Thank you, Heather.
And thank you for this. And in a way, you answered the question earlier, but maybe I'll repeat it just a way to also end with, which is thoughts about the status of the current women's movement, which is now much broader in many ways. It's all over. Right. And maybe to restate what it is you think we need to do now.
Well, I think what we need to do now is what we did, not to say what some old lady would say, go do what I did, but maybe in a way I am saying that. I mean, in terms of the grassroots organizing, there is no substitute for doing this in Nebraska and South Dakota and Georgia and Washington, D.C. and southern part of Virginia. There's no substitute for the grassroots organizing. So how that should happen, that is up to you. But that it should happen, I think, is the road to success. And I love you, Heather, and thank you for all you've done.
Maybe I'll jump in too. One aspect of Now's history we haven't talked as much about yet is just how many other organizations grew up in the seedbed that Now laid. So Now, founded in 1966 with this radical mission and open-ended vision and structure. But within just a few years, you have the National Women's Political Caucus, National Black Feminist Organization, founded by a cohort of women who wanted to organize separately from Now. And I'm probably missing a few. NARAL, right? And so it's about women, working together through Now, but also now working in coalition with other organizations that have, that are also feminist and dedicated to similar issues, but perhaps working on different valences, doing more direct action, more policy work with more focused priorities. So it's a big landscape of feminist activism, and a more robust one certainly than when Now was that brief window when Now was kind of the only game in town.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you and to everyone in the room. I have a feeling there's a lot of wonderful activists that have done an amazing amount of work over many decades. I just wanted to bring up something that I had heard. Well, first of all, one thing is the concept of oppression of women as being both like economic structures and institutional structures, and then also ideological, like ideas of women being sub-whatever, and that's parallels then also oppression of other people on other sort of by other characteristics. So one statistic that I learned recently was regarding like Now in pornography. Apparently there's a lot of violence towards women in the pornography. And I just heard a statistic, someone had done a survey of young women, maybe college age, asking them, I think the question was, have you been strangled during intercourse, like on a date? And apparently 1/3 of them answered that yes, they had on their last date. Yeah, which was like, oh my gosh. So anyway, so I think that may explain a lot, and I don't know if, if you all just had any sort of comments about sort of how the movement was dealing with that and the cultural issues, as well as like the logistical and legislative ones. So again, thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. I mean, I would leave that question to the activists and the feminists in the room now as to what Now is doing about that issue. But
yeah, I don't know. Can I also want to add to getting Now going again. I also want to. I was on the board of the YWCA here, and I want to call out the other women's rights organization, Choice USA used to be, that I worked with, and they're so much a part of this. It's and whether they came out of Now or were influenced by Now or got started in other ways, I just want to hold up a candle to them too and thank them for their work.
Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have. Do we want to do final notes, final words?
thank you so much for being here tonight for this rich conversation. I hope if there are still outstanding questions or comments, Mary Jean and I, and maybe Charlotte too, can stick around.
Well,
I just wish we could come back together after you've all read the book, because what a different discussion this would be, and what a fabulous one. So I hope you'll all buy the book, but not just buy the book. Don't put it on your shelf.
It looks pretty, but
It's a pretty book, but please read the book, because our future depends on it, on our knowledge and really implementing a different agenda than we have been, or an additional agenda that really brings us closer to the finish line. So thank you.
I want to thank you both. After last year when Dobbs came down, there was this talk of a red wave coming by a lot of mass media who have no idea what they're talking about. And then it came out to be a complete failure. Republicans failed way below expectations in the midterms. And then Kansas came around. But before Kansas, before that ballot question that all motivated us, your book was the thing that kicked me in the ass about, 6 months ago. And it was the thing that just made me galvanized. It lit a fire in me that I think had been a little extinguished by the past few years. And so I just want to thank you for that. Folks, please buy the book. By the way, buy it as a gift for the young people in your life, not just young women, but young men, young non-binary people. Buy it for all the young people in your life so they understand the history and they're not weaponized by this insane propaganda that is pushed by the right wing against our movements and divides us so thoroughly. Let's buy the book for everybody so they can learn our history. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.